Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Simone. I'm community manager with the OED team, and I'm delighted to be here with my colleagues and guest speakers. And without further ado, I will now hand it over to my colleague, our panel chair, Dr. Danica Salazar, so she can do a round of introductions and begin the discussion. And I'll disappear behind the scenes. So, Danica, over to you.
Thank you so much, Simone, and thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from wherever, depending on where you are joining us in the world. And happy Pride. It is absolutely delightful for me to be here with you all today to discuss the topic of LGBTIAQ plus vocabulary and lexicography. And it is my privilege to be joined today by an esteemed panel of experts on this topic. So we have, in the order that I can see them on my screen, Anansa Bembo, an editor on the Oxford Dictionary of African American English, Stephen Turton from the University of Oxford, Jonathan Dent, from editor on the Oxford English Dictionary, and Lindsay Rose Russell from the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. So I would just like to start by asking each one of you to talk a little bit about yourselves and your current role and the research that you're currently doing in relation to the topic that we have up today. Perhaps you could start with Jonathan.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Dent. I'm a senior editor working on the revision of existing entries for the Oxford English Dictionary, third edition. I trained as a medievalist, but I also spend time at OED drafting new entries and revising existing ones to do with gender and sexuality, alongside my regular work, and drafting guidance on definition writing for other editors working on those type of words.
Thanks, Jonathan. Anansa?
Hi, everyone. So as a lexicographer for the Oxford Dictionary of African American English, I work on researching and drafting entries for that dictionary. And part of that is investigating the origins of the terms, and a lot of which we're finding coming from the Black queer community. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Stephen?
Hi everyone, I'm a departmental lecturer in English language at Oxford University, and one aspect of my research is on the history of language and sexuality. I wrote a book called Before the Word Was Queer, Sexuality and the English Dictionary from 1600 to 1930, which was published by Cambridge University Press last year. And I also work kind of unrelatedly on the letters of Sir James Murray, who was the first chief editor of the OED.
Thanks, Stephen, and congratulations on that publication. And Lindsay, finally, over to you.
Hello, I'm Lindsay Rose Russell. I'm a professor of English and Writing Studies. I too study the history of English language lexicography. I specialize in the social and material history of dictionaries, how they're made, who makes them, what effects they have in the world. My first book is about women, gender, and dictionary making. And I'm currently working on a book about dictionaries and sex, covering everything from early modern dictionaries of courtship to online queer and trans lexicography.
Thanks, Lindsay. That we're certainly looking forward to when that book comes out. Okay, so we have a very long and interesting discussion ahead of us. But before we start, we'd like to get everyone online listening to us involved a little bit. And we have prepared a poll that we're quickly going to do right now that's going to flash on your screen. So what do you think is according to the Oxford English Dictionary, what do you think is the oldest word recorded in the dictionary, of course, used with their LGBTIQ plus meaning? So is it gay, trans, lesbian, or drag? So which ones do you think? So all of these words are in the OED with their queer meanings, but which one is recorded to be the oldest? The most popular answer is lesbian, which is 36%, and then drag at 35%, and then gay at 24%, and trans at 5%. So, Jonathan, then, could you tell us a little bit how, the OED has documented LGBTQIA plus vocabulary throughout its history, in its previous editions and particularly in its current edition, which is, of course, the one that you're currently working on as an editor. Could you give us a little bit of background on that?
Well, the OED has been, the idea of the OED sort of arose in the middle of the 19th century, but it's from the late 1870s that James Murray started to compile entries, although evidence had been crowdsourced for them before that. Now, with a 20-year gap in the middle of the 20th century, since then, OED has been running more or less continuously, and that means that it's been around for and responding to most of the advances and some of the setbacks in LGBTIAQ life and liberation. And Simone, I think, has a timeline for us which shows publication history of OED and some important moments during the production of OED in queer life. So although as you can see from that timeline, it's running in parallel with quite a lot of important early events. As Stephen details in his books, some of the early attempts by German and British sexologists to sort of look at queer identities outside of the criminal and the religious sphere, which is where they'd mostly been paid attention to, don't actually make it into the first edition of OED. So homosexual, for example, and heterosexual both make their first appearances in OED in 1933 in the first supplement. And that means that a lot of the queer experiences, the words relating to queer experience visible in the first edition are basically terms that we'd see as now as derogatory or involving a degree of negative judgment, negative moral judgment, range from the literary to the biblical, from slang to Latinate and technical terms. Dictionary entries often because they're products of their time, and although Murray had very clear scientific principles and very descriptive principles, they often reflect, to a certain extent, that judgment or are quite coy about specific sexual meanings. So if we look at the first edition entry for the camp or slang term molly, which is now usually associated with a sort of 18th century, now largely associated with a kind of 18th century subculture among men in London. That was kind of a proto-gay subculture. You can see the OED first edition definition relies very heavily on the idea of effeminacy and uses the term milksop. And it's very, it decides to ignore the fact that there's a very clear sexual meaning in quote 1785 from Grose's Dictionary of the Vulgar Tongue. But you can also see how we've updated that in our current edition to refer to unpack the idea of effeminacy particularly, and also to be more explicit about what that word meant for much of its history. Later volumes of the first edition do represent some attempts to provide English terms for queer identity, things like Uranian, that are being used actually by gay people to describe their experience in the late 19th century. But it's not until the second supplement to the OED began in the 1960s that we began to really see language likely to have originated, lots of language likely to have originated from within queer communities appear, with entries like camp and femme and butch in their specific LGBTIAQ plus meanings, making their debut in the 1972 volume of the supplement. The massive changes in queer lives and visibility following the legalization of gay sex in Britain, Stonewall, and the emergence of the gay pride movement. If we go back to the timeline, we can see how those relate. Have increasingly been reflected in sort of the projects to make additions to the OED in the 90s, and from the 90s onwards, the third edition of OED appearing online. So to take a couple of examples, gay and lesbian subcultures are represented with senses for otter and drag king that have appeared in the last 5 years. And older entries demonstrate sometimes the often shifting and developing attitudes that people have to the labels they've used to identify themselves and describe their lives, and things like transgender. You can see that both the adjective and noun make their first appearance in publications which are, I mean, Female Mimics International looks rather strange to us as something that might be produced from the trans community, but actually much of the early evidence that's available through the Digital Transgender Archive, for example, is from these magazines which were circulated among trans people as well as outside of the community. And non-binary also is another example from later, where it's being used for the first time in a Usenet news group for transgender people in 1995. So constantly, as with everything in OED, constantly being updated, constantly being added to, and constantly being developed, hopefully.
Thanks, Jonathan. Of course, that's really a fascinating overview of how these words have been recorded in the OED, and really clearly showing that, just like with many aspects of human life, how words are recorded in a general dictionary of a language such as the OED is really affected by the times, the time that the dictionary is being published, and the changes in social attitudes. So really every dictionary and every edition of a dictionary is a product of its time. But of course, the OED is just one of the many dictionaries that have attempted to document the specific vocabulary of the queer community. So I turn now to Stephen. So could you tell us about other dictionaries that the history of queer lexicography, and how it began and how it developed in its earliest stages?
Yeah, sure. So when we talk about LGBTQ lexicons, we're broadly dealing with two types of text. There are lexicons written by and for LGBTQ people, and there are lexicons written by and for people outside of those communities. So the very first glossaries devoted to LGBTQ terms were published in the early 20th century, and most of them fell into that outsider category. They were compiled by psychiatrists and criminologists and sociologists who presented LGBTQ vocabulary almost as a code that needed to be deciphered in order to police or therapize or research LGBTQ people more effectively. And you can see this reflected in the titles on the slide. So these glossaries appeared in books like A Manual of Psychiatry in 1927, Sexual Hygiene and Pathology in 1955, Sex Crimes in 1960, and so on. But a partial exception is the very earliest glossary on the slide, published in 1910 and written by Isidore Leo Pavia. So Pavia's main claim to fame is translating several of Oscar Wilde's plays into German, but he also published a series of scholarly articles in a German psychiatric journal about what he called male homosexuality in London. And one of those articles contained a glossary. So you can see a scan of that glossary here, and you can see it has English headwords with German translations because it's a German journal. But even if you don't speak German, you can see that it includes several terms that are still in use more than 100 years later, like drag, camp, and queen, alongside terms that are now less familiar to us, like tom for a lesbian and BM for a straight man. Pavia's knowledge of London's gay bars and private parties makes it very clear that he moved in these circles himself. But because his work was aimed at a wider audience in 1910, he didn't explicitly identify himself as a member of the community he was describing. However, he is still an important forerunner to later LGBTQ lexicographers.
Right, so that's an interesting point there of what you just said, Stephen, about Isidore being outside, not exactly being a member of the community. And we'll see that that as a common thread of these attempts to record LGBT dictionary. And I think, Lindsay, you can now continue the story with more contemporary examples of this, where so we see a lot of things being written about the community rather than by them. So does that change at all as we move more towards the later part of the 20th century?
Yeah, and we have another slide with a few more dictionaries from a little bit later on in the timeline. So moving from dictionaries made by persons who sought to pathologize, criminalize, marginalize, and erase queerness and often the rights of queer people. There were also quite a lot of dictionaries historically that were made by people who identified as gay, lesbian, or otherwise queer. Perhaps the earliest of these is to the far left there in 1949, written by a series of pseudonyms that are quite comical in 1949 called the Gay Girls Guide, which included a lexicographical component called the Gayese English Dictionary, which according to its preface was meant to help readers enjoy the full fruits of life. It has 84 entries and a supplemental word list of 30 terms. Many of the words are still in common use today. And we have a slide too of this text, which shows a few of the entries that will sound familiar to some: ante for an older gay man, basket for a genital bulge, BJ for blowjob. The Gay Girls Guide was a source for the Oxford English Dictionary. It's cited 5 times, and it provides the earliest citation evidence in 3 particular instances for around the world, daddy, and glory hole. So there you can see it. And another interesting feature of this dictionary is you'll see that the left-hand side of the page is blank. And that's so that readers and users of the dictionary could add their own terms and notes about language. So a participatory dictionary. But in the timeline, you'll also see one of the more recent queer dictionaries is the 2021 Queen's English by Chloe Davis, which is notably intersectional. It documents a lot of language from Black and Latino, trans, and ball culture. Though I'd note that many of these queer dictionaries are intersectional, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But perhaps the most inventive of the dictionaries listed on this timeline is Monique Wittig and Sandy Steig's 1979 Lesbian Peoples, which is a dictionary that imagines an entirely lesbian world and the language used in that. So it's very fun and weird utopian dictionary. And then perhaps the most comprehensive dictionary among these early LGBTQ lexicons is Bruce Rogers' 1972 Queen's Vernacular. Rogers' dictionary was printed in 1972, and there was an unauthorized reprint in 1978 called Gay Talk that's entirely identical. Both of the dictionaries have 12,000 entries, and they very lovingly document a vast language that is, according to Rogers, outlawed from the comfort of most, which means it covers the language of part and full-time members of the homosexual community, that's Rogers' term, but also the language of Blacks, Chicanos, hippies, ex-convicts, prostitutes, queens, and teens. So a very mixed, heterogeneous community of speakers. And many of the definitions are funny and interesting. Bruise the fruit, for instance, is defined as heard as a jocular reprimand to stop fooling around in a bar. Stop bruising the fruit or the price will go down, is the definition he offers. This dictionary was very favorably received. Even Robert Birchfield, editor-in-chief of the Oxford English Dictionary Supplement, wrote a positive review of it in the New York Times. But his praise shows some of the squeamishness that many earlier OED lexicographers and editors had towards sex generally. Birchfield thought that Rogers did an admirable job of recording the sad language of sexuality. So the Queen's Vernacular, though, isn't very sad in its tone or demeanor. And the OED has used it as a source. It is cited in 46 different entries, and it provides the earliest written evidence of meaning in 12 cases.
Great, thanks, Lindsay. I mean, it's so great to see that So just from the words that you use to describe how these dictionaries present their content, lovingly, and it really shows the difference with how the entries are treated when you have the people who actually use these words or writing about them. There's you mentioned this tendency to pathologize and criminalize the sort of behavior in the earlier dictionaries, and we see that difference in view as you move as we have actual people from the community writing these dictionaries for themselves and about themselves. And it's also great to see that, and then that all of that then feeds into mainstream lexicography as they become sources in themselves for dictionaries such as the OD. And we can also see some of the words that they have added, the dictionaries have added, are familiar to us even today. And this takes me now to our next topic with Anansa, because in your work as an editor on the ODAE, the Oxford Dictionary of African American English, you work on many words that have been invented by queer people of color, which many of which have even gone into mainstream usage and become so entrenched in mainstream usage that many people don't even realize where they originally come from. So could you give us some examples of these words and what they tell us about queer culture and its influence, and how it can shape the vocabulary of English in general?
Yes, thank you. So I do have two examples. And I do want to state that these are draft entries, which means that they're not the final form of the entries, but definitely illustrative enough for us to look at. And so first we have serve as a verb, and we have two different uses of that. So meaning like something like to kind of embody a particular concept or idea, or to exude certain qualities. And then for the next term we have is slay. Similarly, we have two senses for the verb, so meaning something like to perform well, especially at a drag show or ball, or to best an opponent in either of those spaces. And so these words feel particularly topical as they have appeared in mainstream publications and also have very widespread use on social media. And as you mentioned, Danica, commonly been incorrectly etymologized. I feel like I frequently pronounce that wrong, as just being like youth slang. And so like the words that kids are saying today. And so these are just two, though, of many words that we have that come from the Black queer community and have moved into mainstream use, frequently moving from Black queer communities, Black and Latinx queer communities into the language of straight Black people, and also queer non-Black people, and then also into just general mainstream use. And so what this tells us about Black queer culture is how innovative and deep it is, how expansive queerness is, and also how expansive Blackness is, and then even more so together. And so often when we look at communities who are pushed to the margins of society, people who society is not designed thinking about, but also inversely, people who society is designed thinking about specifically with the intent to harm, like what we've seen here in the US with the slew of anti-trans and LGBTQ laws being passed. And so what we see are communities creating their own worlds that are designed specifically for them. And as a result of creating worlds, language is simultaneously created. And so with homophobia in both the wider American society, but also within the Black community, and then racism, we see Black people, Black queer people being denied jobs, housing, being victims of police brutality and harassment, sexual, gender-based violence, medical neglect, and being kicked out of homes by their parents, among other things. And so what we see in Black queer culture is the creation of spaces such as things like the ballroom and buffet flats, which have provided Black queer people with havens and community and opportunity dating as far back as the early 1900s, and both of which are terms that we do have entries also drafted for. And then additionally, we have Black queer culture reimagining family and kinship structures using terms such as mother, children, kids, and all of which also have entries drafted as well. And so through the development of spaces for Black queer people to be safe and receive community, language has been developed to meet the needs of the people. And that's actually one of my favorite things about language, is how it constantly and does change to suit the needs of people. But in these spaces where self-expression and connection and imagination happen, we also see a lot of language innovation, like the two words that were the two words in the slides. And what ends up happening is that the more oppressive groups in society continue to extract from the people that they oppress, placing value on what's produced from the people and not the actual people and the context that it comes from. And so we see appropriation and misattribution of these terms, so things end up getting misrepresented as youth slang or even just general African American English terms when they come more specifically from Black queer people, and really especially from Black trans women. And so I would argue that kind of this rewriting of history or this kind of confusion is a goal to continue such oppression. And so it's why work like this is really exciting to shed light on those histories.
Yeah, thanks, Anansa. Yes, it really highlights the importance of the work that you're currently doing on the ODAE, because that gives you the space to correct the historical record and really show the very clear evidence that exists that where these words actually come from, so that we could correct all of these misappropriations and give queer Black culture the space it deserves in the historical dictionary. And really, it's just the evidence is out there that really shows this history. And for us lexicographers, that's really like the main thing, right? Finding the evidence for these words. So could you all just comment a little bit on that topic of evidence? So how have the sources of evidence evolved throughout time? So what sources of evidence have lexicographers relied on when documenting LGBTQ vocabulary? If you could stay with you and answer, what sources have you used in the ODAE documenting these words from queer Black culture that you've been working on?
So we frequently will reference different types of sources, such as like books, letters, magazines, songs, different types of digital media, newspapers. And what is especially helpful are databases that allow us to filter for queer authors or like certain subject matter. But the difficulty with finding sources for us really lies in like America's very long history of homophobia and racism. And like the way that the identity of being queer and Black intersects means that queer Black people do face a unique set of challenges among the wider American society, and then also within the Black community, which has stifled the existence of material for and by queer Black people. And so, like as an example, Black people being prevented from learning to read and write during slavery, into labor after slavery, and then kind of just dealing with the rest of like America up until today, also means that queer Black people are also right there being denied access to literacy, forced into labor, and dealing with the rest of America. And then to the ways in which the Black community has continuously tried to make queer people invisible in our spaces. These experiences and more really contribute to the lack of sources that like we could have for this project specifically, but also to just the sources that could be in existence in addition to the ones that are today, that would be affirming and celebrated in general, just because they should exist since the people exist. And so like one thing that's really benefited us is like self-publishing, especially with Black queer magazines and zines specifically. And I actually just went to this really cool Black Zine Fest here in Brooklyn. And there is one coming to Detroit. But it was super cool, very Black, very queer. And so like historically, these types of publications have allowed us to have agency over our voice and tell our own stories. And so we do have archives of publications such as Black Lines, Thing, B&G, and something that's not necessarily a zine, but a documentary which features Black, trans, and queer people's own voices is Paris is Burning, which we reference quite a bit And then there is one publication in particular that I really enjoyed learning the history about, and I'm still learning the history about, and that is Fire. And it's spelled all capital letters Fire with 2 exclamation points. But it was a magazine created in 1926 during the Harlem Renaissance by young writers, many of whom were in their 20s. All were Black, some queer, some not, but folks such as Wallace Thurman, Countee Cullen, Louis Grandison, Alexander, Richard Bruce Nugent, Zora Neale Hurston, Aaron Douglas, Gwendolyn Bennett, John P. Davis, and Langston Hughes. And this publication prioritized conversations that were considered controversial at the time, and many still considered controversial today. So things like gender and sexuality, colorism, sex work, class, and the authors, as a linguist, like what's really cool too for me is that the authors maintained that the use of African American English was necessary for the voice of the publication, which was a decision that was very criticized at the time. And then additionally, the subject matter was also very, very criticized by Black media, especially as it related to queerness. And so the publication, unfortunately, only released 1 issue because of the difficulty that they had with funding and support. And then the building where they published also burned down. I don't know how that happened. That's the history I'm still trying to learn. And so but this is what I mean by like a unique set of experiences at the intersection of being Black and queer, because neither like white America nor Black America made space for something like this to exist because of racism and homophobia. But nowadays we consider these writers to be like among the greatest in our country. Like, their writings are assigned to students of all ages, and these like are the voices of the Harlem Renaissance that get talked about so much. And then another way in which we're like affected by systemic oppression with not having access to various types of work that could have been published without it, is that, but also though people like needing a certain level of secrecy to remain safe, is that for our drafting of our entries, we try to locate the earliest recorded use of a term. And so it is commonly the case for words that we have that we know existed before our earliest recorded use. And so that is like a way in which our dictionary suffers a bit because of such oppression.
Yeah, that's a good point, Anand. So I was actually going to ask Lindsay that, because it seems like the most reasonable thing to do is just to go to the source, ask the community about the words that they use. But then it's not as straightforward as that, is it? So what are the dangers when marginalized people are used as sources of linguistic evidence?
Many marginalized speakers, and speakers marginalized for all different kinds of reasons, race, class, gender, sexuality, even, speakers of other languages that might be entirely oral or don't have a written alphabet. Many speakers are sort of suspicious of lexicographical projects and reluctant to be described by outsiders because outsiders' descriptions tend to be less accurate. And so it can be very difficult to create an accurate dictionary if you don't have an intimate knowledge of and even participate in a community. So I think it's an underappreciated aspect of dictionary making that it requires a great deal of trust. And so that's something that sort of mainstream dictionaries need to build. Some of the smaller dictionaries that we've talked about historically were made by insiders to certain communities, and they had then the advantage of being able to eavesdrop, listen in, take notes on oral communication. And so many amateur dictionaries, unlike the OED, don't require written evidence in order to enter a word into the lexicon. So we actually have a slide of some of Bruce Rogers' research. He, in collecting his dictionary, would go to various places and listen in. He also surveyed some of his friends and had informal conversations, and he took notes on everything. His archive is just full of scribbles on napkins and matchbooks and all kinds of different things. And so he used sort of unconventional sources for evidence, but then he sort of compiled it in such a way that looks somewhat like what some early OED material looks like. The Oxford English Dictionary was built with lots of different slips that were organized in pigeonholes. So Rogers sort of created slips similar to that, though his evidence didn't come from books. It came from conversations and other things that he'd had, though he also consulted a few sort of magazines and things like that. So the documentation, the evidence can be sort of different when you need to document people who might not have as much access to publishing their own stories in certain ways, even though that is the gold standard of lexicographical evidence for many mainstream dictionaries.
Okay, thanks, Lindsay. Well, so staying on this topic of the importance of secrecy in the creation of these of queer language, that there is this history of queer people adopting secret languages so that they can communicate with each other without fear of exposure or persecution. So could you give some examples of these secret codes, how they've been used and when they fell out of use? Jonathan, there's one example that a lot of us know of is Polari, for example.
Yeah, so Polari is particularly associated with gay men these days, but it has a complex history. I mean, etymologically, it blends different forms of rhyming slang, back slang, and cant, which is an older sort of criminal slang, along with Italianate words and other elements to create what is basically what is sometimes called an anti-language, a language that can be used by a group to conceal its meaning and to protect its communication from wider society, essentially. Of course, in Britain, in the particularly between the 1880s and the 1960s, but before that as well, people had to conceal their sexuality and the fact that they were looking for sex and having sex, or just meeting romantic partners. If we look at OED's first attempt to deal with Polari from the 1980 supplement, so this is the 1980 supplement entry for Parliari, which is what became the Polari entry in the current version of OED. And you can see that the uses that are being highlighted here are from actors and showmen, and what it was particularly common among circus performers and other kind of show business people, but also among sailors. The OED also, the OED supplement also suggests it's something that's had its day, that it was particularly common in the 18th and 19th centuries, and that isn't really being used very much. You can see the last quote talks about the canting jargon of Victorian fairgrounds. And our evidence for some of the words that have entered wider usage from Polari, things like Namti meaning no, and Omi and Polone meaning man and woman, and Bona meaning good or excellent, all stretch back in OED to the mid-19th century for their first quotations. But as a second language, Polari had its own double life or second act, a secret language rather. And in the 20th century, it became particularly common among gay men, particularly in London, I think, as they avoided detection by the police. It's a subset on just being able to have a conversation in a cafe with nobody knowing that you're talking about the fact that you're gay or what you're getting up to in your nightlife. One of the reasons why it's come to so much prominence is the popular British radio comedy of the 1960s called Round the Horn, which OED uses many quotes from, but in particular there were segments featuring characters Julian and Sandy, who were flamboyant out-of-work actors who were never identified as gay. This is just on the cusp of legalization, Round the Horn. but they were played with relish and a great deal of double entendre by gay actors Kenneth Williams and Hugh Paddock, and their appearances are liberally peppered with Polari. So you have this bizarre situation where there's this secret language being used among gay men in London, but people in the wider country are sitting at home having their Sunday lunch and laughing at a kind of family comedy show on the radio, which is using the secret language of these gay men. And Round the Horn provides our early evidence for words like naff, which are kind of passed into wider usage from Polari, or probably from Polari. And for the noun juge, the verb juge, which is a couple of years later, came to even wider audience more recently in Queer Eye for the Straight Guy. And as you can see from our current entry for Polari, they completely revised our definition to include gay use, also to draw attention to that very important raising of profile in Round the Horn, and change the head word to reflect, as we do with all OED entries, the most common current form of a head word. So that's, as you say, probably lots of people know about Polari, but not necessarily about its history outside of the gay community. And it's a good example of queer people using resources that are available, and those kind of overlaps between groups like actors and show people and queer people.
Right, thanks, Jonathan. Stephen, are there any other examples apart from Polari of these secret codes?
Yeah, so I mean, there are lots through history, but I think it's also important to note that queer codes are sometimes used across a community or a social circle, but they can also be highly individualized to just, you know, one or two or three people. So one of our earliest examples comes from the diary of Anne Lister. So Anne Lister, if you don't know her, was a gentlewoman who lived in the early 1800s in Yorkshire, and she wrote about her relationships with women in coded passages in her diary. So you might have seen the brilliant TV series about her life, Gentleman Jack by Sally Wainwright. But here is a photograph of Lister's diary entry for the 30th of January, 1817. And you can see that most of it is written in her code, which she called crypthand. So I've transliterated the first few words of the entry, which say, "Mariana gave me 2 very good kisses last night." So Mariana was one of Lister's long-term romantic partners, and Lister not only wrote in this invented alphabet, but she also used code words to talk about her sex life. So in this case, kisses doesn't mean actual kisses, it means orgasms. And in the left-hand margin, you'll see that under the date and time, Lister has included a symbol that looks a bit like a capital Q. So that is the mark she placed next to entries that documented her kisses with women, so that she could find those entries again when she reread the diary. So for Lister, this was obviously a very personal code, but recently her alphabet has been taken up by online communities, mostly of lesbian and queer women, who have been inspired by Lister's life. And you can now get coded messages printed on t-shirts and fridge magnets and coffee mugs. So although it's not exactly a secret code anymore, the code has been revived as a symbol of community.
Yeah. Thanks, Stephen. And yes, Gentleman Jack's a really good series. Highly recommend it. I think it's still on the UCI player now. Well, now turning to our editors here, Anantha and Jonathan, could you describe, so because we've mentioned just how language changes with society, so could you both describe when you've had how you deal with these changes, changes in sensitivity around queer language, anachronisms, or words that may seem neutral at face value but turn out not to be really neutral when you've done your research, or maybe derogatory or offensive words that are later reclaimed, which is something that also happens a lot. So how do you go about facing these sorts of challenges? And answer.
And so I also have two slides here to kind of just show an example of like the challenge sometimes in drafting words specifically that refer to people. And so we have a Snow Queen here as a noun, which refers typically to a man who is intimately interested in someone who is primarily white men. And then we have another term, banji, which has a couple different definitions, but refers typically to Black or Latinx, and also typically men who are going to like exude certain personality traits, dress in a certain way, things of this sort. And I think there is another slide as well that shows one of the other senses. So like a challenge in drafting words specifically that relate to people and people that come from marginalized communities that we find is that much of the prevalent language that is used to talk about marginalized people comes from narratives formed by like the dominant socio-political group. And so oftentimes that language is like offensive and violent. And so like when approaching these definitions, we do spend time thinking about the language to use to make sure that we're avoiding stereotyping and other biased language that would further add to the marginalization, and also to instead use language that the people who use this particular term would use in relation to it. So yeah, thank you.
Jonathan, any comments on this?
I think one of the examples is a word we've been using relatively freely today, which is queer, which is sort of well known as a relatively controversial term, with some people regarding it as a slur, some people regarding it as a perfectly acceptable self-designation, and then the strand of use which refers more specifically to anyone with non-traditional gender identities. I think things we often find as a historical dictionary is looking at the history of these words, where we expect a sort of linear development from slur to reclamation or something like that, is that things shift around and that sometimes different sentiments attached to words are almost baked in from the beginning. So, I mean, the first evidence we have for the noun queer used to refer to a person is from the 19th century's most famous homophobe, probably the Marquis of Queensberry, writing in the 1890s. But then fast forward to 1914, and our first evidence for the adjective used to designate a person who is gay or doesn't have a traditional heterosexual identity, seems to be from within the community. It's at two levels of indirect quotation, so it's a bit difficult to see, but it seems to be a man talking about a Los Angeles club that he goes to and enjoys going to, where queer people gather and where queer people wear the most expensive drag and generally have a good time. So, I mean, that's not an unusual sort of pattern for nouns and adjectives, but it's striking, I think, that even from the outset, there's kind of different early evidence. The early evidence for the two words is very different in terms of what's out there. And that's something we've got to grapple with and represent as best we can, usually in the form of notes, as well as the labeling, which marks things as derogatory, but also notes explaining that sometimes a derogatory term will be reclaimed or used as a self-designation. And even relatively formal words, which don't seem like they've got a lot of derogatory weight built in, like homosexual, that the changes that affected that word mean, I mean, we're all familiar with the fact now that gay is probably the most widely accepted term for same-sex oriented men and women, but that requires some unpacking for a term that was kind of the standard, formal, widely accepted term for gay people earlier in the century.
Great. Well, this has all been very fascinating. I could stay here and talk to you all on this topic for hours and hours, but fortunately I can't. So we're getting close to the end of our time, and I'd like to leave some time for questions. So just to wrap up, could I just go like round the our roundtable and ask everyone your thoughts on the future of LGBTQ vocabulary and its documentation. So, what do you think is the way forward, and how do you think can members of the community reclaim their words and shape language so it can be a tool for empowerment rather than oppression, as we've just discussed? And we as lexicographers and as researchers of this topic, how can we help with that? So, any thoughts on this, Lindsay?
Well, I'll take us away from the OED for a minute just to say that you don't have to be the Oxford English Dictionary to make a dictionary. All kinds of people make all kinds of dictionaries, and making a dictionary can be a way to articulate the unique vocabulary and values of a community while also celebrating the complexities that exist within that community. So make a dictionary, maybe.
That's a really good way to go about it. And yes, I mean, as a lexicographer myself, it's certainly a job I would recommend. So if you have any one of you has the time or resources to start to work on your own dictionary, and that's one of the good things of being in this digital era, that Anansa was talking about self-publication. So there are many different means now to be able to create a dictionary and many ways to share it with people who can contribute also to the work of recording words.
Future lexicographers will thank you for making that dictionary and will quote you.
Yeah. We certainly would love to have people join us in this in the future or even now. Stephen, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, sorry. You think years after the pandemic, I'd remember to unmute myself. But I would say, I think lexicographers, professional lexicographers, should continue to seek out older sources written by LGBTQ people where they exist, not just about them, to show that these LGBTQ vocabularies and communities have a history that goes back beyond the 20th century, and to show that LGBTQ people have been defining themselves on their own terms for longer than we might think.
Yeah, and I think that's something that you really made very clear to all of us today, that this is not something new, because people tend, as Ananta said before, people tend to look at these words and say, oh, look at, these words that the young people use, but these words have a really long history, and the effort to document them also has a really long history that that would be good for all of us to be aware of and to read up on as well. So we have people like Stephen and Lindsay writing these histories. So read up on their stuff because it's absolutely fascinating. Anansa.
Yeah. Also, to just add to what Jonathan said, I am frequently thanking people of the past for their work in documentation. And so the people of the future will also thank you. And so I do think it's a little bit like tricky to kind of think about how members of a community can like reclaim the language. So it is not like necessarily used as a tool of oppression, just because the system is working. So like being constantly kind of under attack in a white supremacist heteronormative society, like here in the US, like where it seems like everything people like produce just gets extracted from you and used as a tool of oppression, because a big goal is to like maintain that power. But being a linguist in training, what I've learned from like field linguists is how institutions who benefit from documenting such language should work with the communities to give back, to provide opportunity. And I think we're talking about like people publishing their own dictionaries and being lexicographers. And I think a lot can be accomplished by giving queer Black people jobs across sectors and just in general, and opportunities and supporting mutual aid efforts to help cover housing costs, especially for people who often need emergency housing, who are ousted from their families or who are moving to be safe, and also things like gender affirming care. And I think kind of supporting people in this way would show that you value them as creators of this language.
Thanks, Nansa. Jonathan, just some final thoughts before we move on to questions.
I think as a historical lexicographer and somebody who has, I completely agree with Stephen about the looking at early sources written by queer people. But I think we've also got a challenge with the way things are shifting away from traditional publishing and from easily accessible sources to understand how we're going to track new vocabulary if it doesn't fit into the established patterns that we've set out for assessing whether things get added to the dictionary in terms of appearance in printed texts and that kind of thing. And I think we're doing good work on that, but also those early sexological and psychological tracts and glossaries do give us an early look at vocabulary in use. And it's just a question of whether there are going to be people out there, again, to say, as I did about what Lindsay said, we're going to be grateful for people who are recording stuff as words that are in use, that are interesting and seem new to them, or particularly representative of particular experiences.
Right. Thanks, Jonathan. Well, what I personally think is quite fascinating about LGBT vocabulary is just how fast-moving it is, and that's one of the difficulties as well of recording it, is just how much it changes so quickly and how quickly it adapts to the needs of the people who use it. But that's also, I think, should be a source of hope for us, because no matter how much it's oppressed, no matter how much the system tries to obliterate it, it's always there, and even I think it even thrives the more people try to oppress it. And even with all of the challenges in front of it, it's still there. It's still continuing, and it's even influencing the way that we use language in general, whether we lexicographers are here to document them or not. So I think that as long as there's a future for humanity, there's a future for queer vocabulary and for queer lexicography. So thank you so much to all of you for joining me today to talk about this this fascinating topic on during Pride Month. So it's really a privilege for me to have facilitated this discussion. But before we end, I would like to just give a few minutes to ask some of the questions that we have here on the chat, and maybe you guys can answer some of them. Okay, let's see. So a lexicography specific question from Harriet Blackman. Maybe Jonathan, you can take this. So how do the editorial team decide which entries to prioritize during the revision process?
Well, we are very fortunate these days. When we first started to revise the text for the third edition, we had to move alphabetically through chunks of entries, because that was just the way the editorial system was set up to work. These days we're able to move around the text of the dictionary, take individual entries and update individual sentences. And in the past few years we've started to work on refreshing the text of the dictionary for its 100th anniversary in 2028. The completion of the first edition was in 1928. And one of the things we've been doing is looking at words which have particularly changed their meaning, or where the first attempts of the OED lexicographers in the 19th and early 20th centuries sort of fall short in our estimation, to the extent that they can, given what they achieved. So it's basically we rely on things like our own encounters with entries, but also things like people asking us questions about entries because there's something that they don't understand, or something appears to be missing, or something like that. So there are many different ways we prioritize entries for revision. And I suppose one of the things that's very important in the context of this discussion is sensitivity.
Thanks. So a question specifically addressed to Stephen. So do you see parallels between the 18th century silencing of same-sex desire and how modern institutions handle LGBTQ plus terminology today? That's from Renat Berger.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, I do, in the sense that I think there are two kind of approaches to this sort of language that apply to the 18th century and across history, which is that institutions try to suppress people by silencing language about them, but institutions also try to control people by publicizing language about them and attempting to fix its meaning in place. So, and we can see, for instance, today, silencing in the current opposition of the US administration to the use of vocabulary associated with gender and sexuality, among other things, in federal documents and funding applications. And we can see attempts at controlling language in court cases, stretching back to the 1970s, about the meanings of words like marriage and woman and man and sex, very recently in the UK as well, where dictionaries often get cited in court cases, including the OED, as evidence of what words really mean. But as any of the lexicographers here will tell you, dictionaries are meant to define words, not to confine them. So words mean what people use them to mean. And sometimes people don't agree on what the meaning of a word should be, but that doesn't mean one usage is inherently more valid or accurate than another. And I think that's an important thing to bear in mind at whatever point in time you happen to be living through.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. A question from Puck Malamud about the use of ephemera. So to what degree are you able to use ephemera, such as event flyers, for things like drag balls as sources? I know by its nature, ephemera is hard to hang on to. So maybe, Lindsay, you could comment a little bit on how these type of, if at all, if this type of sources have been used in earlier dictionaries that you've seen, and then maybe we could go to an answer, and you can answer if you do use it in your current work on DODAE. Lindsay?
Absolutely. I think in the archives that I've visited, I've seen a lot of different ephemera, and whether or not that's sort of cited in different dictionaries, a lot of sort of smaller amateur made lexicons don't necessarily have the same robust citation practices that you might be familiar with in the OED. So you might not necessarily see the direct link to the ephemera in the archive as annotated in the dictionary itself. But it's certainly something that many amateur lexicographers draw on. And I know that the OED and other contemporary dictionaries do use different kinds of materials beyond sort of a confined sort of understanding of only certain kinds of publications count. I think that has been expanding in lexicographical practice as time goes on.
An answer?
Yeah, so to add, like, yes, we do when we can. And so using things like, especially event flyers and different types of maybe people's like personal ads that people are passing out on the street that get collected, end up in like a bin, and then turn up at places like the Schomburg Center here in New York, which is something that we've used for the dictionary. What becomes like the only challenge sometimes is that archives of ephemera might be a little bit harder to search through, because all of the information may not appear when you're like searching through. Sorry, I don't know where I can, like when you search, it may not be highlighted. And so it does take time. And so like if you have like the time and you're willing, or you know for a fact that you're going to look through something that is going to give you a head word that you're researching, you can definitely flip through, those types of archives. But yes, so when we can, we do, and they are valuable.
Thank you. Okay, a question from Christopher about the etymology of molly. So is it etymologically linked to mole in the sense of prostitute, i.e. as in Daniel Defoe's Moll Flanders from the 18th century? Jonathan, could you take this one?
Both words are diminutives of women's personal names. So they're both derived from Mary. And this is kind of a common pattern. There are other words from the same period, like Madge, which I worked on recently, which also have a similar range of senses, where they're used as a general term for a woman. Then they use the term occasionally use the term for a prostitute, although moll is very frequently used in that way. And then you get senses which relate basically to people we could regard now as gay men, and also effeminate men, generally. So they men who don't conform to traditional stereotypes of masculinity in one way or another get called by women's names. I mean, it still goes on with I mean, it's a bit outdated now, but things like Muscle Mary and that kind of thing, these words that use women's names to imply that men are not as manly as they should be in one way or another.
Thank you. So are there, maybe anyone can answer this if you can think of an example. A question from Dintak Nan. Not that well up on my Vietnamese pronunciation, so I'm sorry if I mispronounced the name. So the question is, are there particular entries whose senses or nuance have provably changed within the last 5 years? So any words that you have encountered that have recently taken on this change?
I know that for one of the words that I had that in the slide, slay, that I don't think we currently have a noun use of that drafted, and I think that there needs to be a noun use of that drafted. I don't know if that's something that has developed like within the last 5 years, but the verb use, at least through the research, looked way more prevalent than the noun use, and so like that's something I would kind of like add to be drafted. But because it does seem like terms are changing very quickly, changing as like outgroup users are using them, and changing as they're spreading across social media. So yeah.
Okay. Any other examples anyone can think of? I actually have one, but but it's not in the past 5 years, but the past 10 years, more than 10 years, exactly 10 years now, because one of the first words that I ever drafted as an editor for the OED is the word cisgender. So I remember I did that in December 2014, something like that. It was I was still in training. It was one of my first words. And I remember very distinctly that when I was doing that, first of all, I didn't know what it meant. And almost all of the sources that I could find were strictly academic. So lots of queer studies, gender studies, sort of a thing. So now it's really fascinating to me, like how 10 years later that word cisgender and cis just is part of everyone's general vocabulary, when just 10 years ago when I was researching it, it was something that was really very niche and very academic and very specific to people who are interested in a very particular topic. So it just really shows how quickly words are changing, especially these days. So great. I think that's all the questions that we have time for now. So I'd like to wrap up by saying that this has been a total slay, if that's a correct word, is the correct way to use slay as a noun, an answer. Or this has been bona fabulosa, as speakers of Polari might say. And in the Creole language where I come from in the Philippines, we would say that this has been totally bonga. So thank you so much for all of your wonderful insights and for your willingness to be here with me today to talk about this fascinating topic.
Before we end, I would like to mention that this event is dedicated to the memory of our colleague and friend, Joseph Kennedy, who tragically passed away in November 2024. Joseph was part of our OUP LGBTIAQ+ committee, and he was also Jonathan's husband. We all miss him a lot. Joseph loved words and was brilliant with them, and we would like to think that he would have enjoyed this discussion very much. I wish you enjoyed it too. Thank you very much for watching.